Hey gang, we're here to talk about the lumber industry in Minnesota. So, just to point out a couple things here before we get started, which is Minnesota has vast forested regions. Starting in the southern eastern part of the state, there is mostly a mixed or a deciduous forest, which means leaf bearing trees, and some coniferous trees, pine needle trees. As you move farther north into central Minnesota, the coniferous forests start to take a bigger part of the state there. And so there was great white pine forests in those regions. So let's take a look at how important the lumber industry was to us. A worker story on page 160, and we'll go through to 163. Horace Glenn in the lumber industry. Minnesota's lumber industry was operating at its peak in the winter of 1900 to 1901 when 21-year-old Horace Glenn arrived in Minnesota's northeastern Arrowhead region to work as a lumberjack. Glenn had come for money and adventure. He considered himself well-educated and well-mannered, the superior of other lumberjacks he worked with. But in letters to his parents in Aberdeen, South Dakota, he said he was glad to be there. I enjoy the work better than any I'd ever did before. For me, sawing is the best job in the woods. The time passes quickly, and although it's very cold from 0 to 30 below so far, you don't notice it as much in the timber, meaning he doesn't feel it as cold when he's in the woods. And when I eat at home would scarcely be a light lunch for me, meaning when he's there working as a lumberjack, he's eating big meals. Burning a lot of calories. Even in the cold, you're burning a lot of calories. Horace Glenn worked as a swamper, cutting branches off felled trees. For Glenn and his fellow lumberjacks, the day started at 4 in the morning. They woke up, ate a big breakfast of pancakes, pork, and beans, and headed out the woods for the rest of the day. Snow, rain, or shine. The camp cooks brought lunch at midday. In the winter, most lumberjacks learned how to eat quickly before the food froze. After returning to camp, they ate dinner and then headed to the bunkhouse, where most were asleep by 9 o'clock. Lumberjacks had one day off, Sunday. Men occasionally attended church services conducted by traveling ministers, but mostly spent the day playing cards, writing letters, and paying a little attention to personal hygiene. If nothing else, it was a day to boil your clothes and kill the lice that infested them. Horace Glenn tried his best to stay clean, but it was difficult with no running water and little soap and shared bath water. I have the barber's itch now, he wrote his parents, describing a rash caused by a skin fungus. My face is a fright, but it is healing up. By March, Glenn was itching to join up with a work crew on the springtime log drive. All winter workers stacked logs by the side of the river. When the ice melted on the river, crews drove the logs downstream to the sawmills. Log driving was a dangerous work, but the wages were good, as much as $2.50 a day. Glenn hoped to make enough money on the river to pay for a trip back to South Dakota. Page 161, you can look at. There's a picture of loggers eating breakfast. And then there's some tools on there too. If you look at the top of page 162, the log jam blocked at St. Croix River in Taylor's Falls in 1886. It took 200 men 6 weeks using dynamite and hard work to break these logs loose. How many men do you find in the photo? If you look down to the lower left corner, there's probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 men, and there's other men scattered along the logs. Kind of interesting. If you go to Stillwater, their summer celebration is Lumberjack Days. They do log rolling contests, have rides, a fair, and everything else. Although because it's 2020, that will be canceled. It's already been canceled for this year. Stillwater was one of the original places that sawmills were created up on the hill, and then because there was forested land from Stillwater North and Stillwater West and Stillwater South. It happened to be a good place for them to log and then send the logs downstream. That's why Stillwater is kind of known for the lumber industry. So some lumber barons were there. The lumber equation on page 162. Rivers and waterfalls were just as important to the lumber industry as they were to flour milling. Rivers served as transportation highways for millions of logs. Lumber companies built sawmills and booms where the logs were sorted and stored. At several of the state's waterfalls, towns grew up near the sawmills and booms. People came to work in the industry. Natural resources. For hundreds of years, vast forests of white pine, a tree highly prized for its high-quality lumber, covered much of northern Minnesota. White pine could grow more than 125 feet tall and straight in the trunks, had no branches for many feet above the ground. These straight and strong trees made for superior boards for construction. Though logging in Minnesota began in the late 1830s, it wasn't until the 1880s the lumber companies started making major investments of money, machines, and people to harvest the trees. Machines, cross-cut saws, axes, hammers, and hooks were always important tools of the lumber trade, but as the years went on, companies invested in new machines to make the businesses more efficient. Hot water pumps kept the water near the sawmills from freezing so that the mills could run all winter. Faster stream-powered saws helped increase the lumber production, but few innovations were as important as the railways. At first, most logs were hauled to the rivers by horses and floated downstream to the mills. But in the 1890s, lumber companies started using freight trains to move logs out of the forests that weren't near rivers. People. Lumberjacks like Horace Glenn provided the muscle to fell the trees and send the logs downriver, but they were just part of the story. Minnesota's lumber industry would never have developed as quickly as it did without business owners like Frederick Weyerhaeuser. In 1890, Weyerhaeuser and his partners made their first big investment in Minnesota, purchasing hard-to-reach timber in the central part of the state. He eventually expanded his control to sawmill booms and small railroad lines. Because he controlled every step of the lumbering process, he could tightly control costs and profits. By 1900, more than 400 lumber companies, including several belonging to Weyerhaeuser, were operating in the state, and Minnesota ranked third in the nation in lumber production. Towns and cities through the Midwest were built using Minnesota lumber. It was probably a good thing Horace Glenn didn't make a career out of lumberjacking. By 1905, Minnesota's white pines had been cut down and lumber production was beginning to decline. Minnesotans started talking seriously about conserving trees and planting new ones. But by then it was too late. Many lumber mills in Minnesota closed and lumber operations moved west to uncut white pine forests. Lumberjacks who wanted to keep working in the lucrative white pine forests had to follow the companies west. Others turned harvesting different kinds of trees, and the rest had to find new work. Horace Glenn never returned to the lumber camps. He became a lawyer instead. If you take a look at page 163 and the picture there of Minnesota and the green and brown line on there, where the green is the coniferous forest and the brown is probably more deciduous, you can see where most of the forests were at where they harvested. Today, there's some of that has been preserved. There's a little bit of old growth forest, it's called. However, it is limited because most of it was all harvested in the 1800s. New trees have been planted, so it's called new growth forest. And there's where the lumber industry made its impact on Minnesota and the rest of the country for that matter. All right, kids, have a great day, and we'll talk to you later.